Hey, what's up guys, it's Lee and you're watching Hang with Lee TV, and of course I'm Lee, and if you're new here, this channel is basically sort of a lifestyle channel where I talk about all things life related. I do reviews and also give advice primarily on personal finance, hence the title of this video, right? So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, consider subscribing. Now in this video, I'm going to talk about why an emergency fund is so important. And it's actually crazy because I always talk about emergency funds in like all of my personal finance videos, but I've never made a video on why you should actually have an emergency fund or what it is or anything like that. So I never made that separate video. So here it is. This is that separate video. So with that being said, let's get started with the video. Okay, so emergency fund, this could be completely new to you, right? You're probably wondering, what is an emergency fund, right? Well, it's pretty simple. I'll break it down, but basically an emergency fund is money that you set aside that is designated solely for the purpose of emergencies. Like, that is it, emergencies only. That's basically what emergency fund is. The reason why you have that emergency fund there is because sometimes things happen in life and sometimes things are expensive and stressful. And so we need to have sort of a cushion for ourselves to sort of, soften the blow a little bit on some of those little hits that life gives us. Life definitely will hit hard sometimes. So we want to have that cushion there as much as possible. And I do want to stress that emergency funds are only for emergencies. Your emergency fund is not for a trip that you decided to go on last minute and it's an emergency because you didn't have the funds for it. Like, that's not what an emergency fund is for. Emergency funds are set aside for like specific purposes that happen, like in life. Like if your car breaks down and you need to, replace an engine, or if you need new tires or brakes, something crazy that just pops up unexpectedly, that's what an emergency fund is for. So when it comes down to an emergency fund, I always recommend that you have at least 6 months of expenses set aside. And so when I say expenses, I mean expenses like, like your mortgage or your rent, your car payment, all of those essential core bills. Make sure you have all of that money saved for 6 months. So hypothetically, if it costs you $1,000 every month for your mortgage, your rent, your car payment, cell phone, all the important things, all those core bills, then you need about $6,000 to save, right? And so you need to figure out a plan in terms of how you're going to actually save that money. So you save your emergency fund first, and then you start to save for your goals and whatever else it is that you're trying to save money for. That way, in case something happens, because it won't really set you back as much because you'll be taking that money out of your emergency fund instead of something else. Okay, so now I'm going to cover 6 reasons why you should definitely have an emergency fund and why it's important. So number 1 is if you're new to budgeting. So usually when you're new to budgeting, you're really just sort of figuring things out. You feel like you're drinking from a fire hydrant or a water hose, right? You're really figuring things out. And so what happens a lot of times when people start budgeting initially is they find it very challenging. They find it very strange, just uncomfortable, and things like that. And what can happen is that life happens and there's an emergency that pops up and they don't know what to do because they've budgeted all of their money for all of these particular things. But then what do they do now because they have this emergency here that's staring them dead in the face and they don't know what to do? Well, that's the number 1 reason why you need to have an emergency fund when you're new to budgeting. So one of the things that you should always do is you should definitely build that emergency fund first initially for yourself, and then go and save the money for your goals, for whatever it is that you're budgeting for. That's what you should do. You can have 3 to 6 months worth of, an emergency fund in terms of expenses saved, when you're new to budgeting, right? You do definitely want to move and work up to that 6-month mark, but it's okay if you start off with 3. Reason number 2 is that you're trying to pay down debt. Now, it's nothing worse than trying to pay down debt and breaking your ankle, or, realizing you need expensive rotors. And then you go there and they tell you need brakes, rotors, and tires, and it's super expensive, right? Let's say that's happened to you and you have some debt, right? And you're trying to pay that off, or maybe it's your student loans, or maybe it's something else, but you're trying to pay down debt, right? So one of the things, again, that can happen to you is that if you don't have an emergency fund, what will happen is that it will take you a lot longer to pay off your debt because you don't have an emergency fund. And every time you have an emergency fund, you'll probably rationalize to yourself like why you should pay a little bit less this month, or maybe you should pay the minimum amount this month instead of actually trying to work to pay the debt off. And not to mention, these emergencies that happen can take money away from your actual savings goal. So that's another reason why you should be really focused on having that emergency fund. Reason number 3 is that it creates a nice cushion if you lose your job. Now, I know none of us want to lose our jobs, and it's something we don't think about too often, and we hope and pray that we don't lose our jobs. But the reality is that sometimes it does happen. But if you don't have any money saved in terms of an emergency fund, well, then you are, pretty much screwed. So you definitely want to have that cushion there that the emergency fund can provide, because let's say it takes you, a full 6 to 8 months to actually get a new job. At least you have that emergency fund that you can live off of, and your stress level can be a lot lower than if you didn't have anything at all. And then also, you're not going to feel that tinge of desperation so intensely if you do have an emergency fund as well. You don't have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from, or if you're going to be able to pay your rent the next month and things like that. You can be more focused on your interviews and your job search instead. So reason number 4, an emergency fund is so important is especially if you are a homeowner. Now, when it comes down to owning a home, if you actually own a home, you know already that everything's on you. So if something breaks, it's on you. If something gets destroyed, it's on you. If a pipe bursts, it's on you. It doesn't matter. It's all on you, and you have to figure it out. And not only do you have to figure it out, well, you have to actually shell the money out for it too, instead of just picking the phone up and letting your landlord know that your, toilet's clogged, or, there's a leak in your ceiling. So having an emergency fund, again, is something that will come in handy, because let's say your basement floods, right? That happens pretty often, right? But a basement flood can actually be pretty expensive depending on how severe it is, right? It can damage your furniture. There can be a lot of damage just to the actual structure itself. And there can be something that you need to act on really quickly, and you have to pay someone to remedy the problem. So having an emergency fund takes that stress away and allows you to take the money that you need to take care of the problem, so that you can, again, continue on with your goals. And not to mention, if you don't have an emergency fund and something like that does happen, well, if you wait because you don't have the money set aside, what can happen is the problem can get worse and worse and worse. And of course, that means it's going to be more and more expensive in the long run too. So that's another reason. Reason number 5 is if you have a medical condition, or if you know you have some sort of ongoing medical thing, right, that is going to cost you money, right? Because it happens, right? You can have a rare disease. You could, who knows? There can be so many different things that can be out there that can happen to you that is reoccurring, and that it can happen. It's going to cost you money. And when it does happen, it costs a lot of money. So you can be prepared for that with an emergency fund, and you can use that money to pay for those expenses that might pop up unexpectedly as well. And that way you're saving yourself the hassle and the stress and the trouble of having to figure out where that money is going to come from. Reason number 6 that you need an emergency fund is that you're saving for a particular goal. So let's say you're saving to buy a house. Everyone's saving to buy a house now. And if you're not, you probably should start, because the market's crazy, right? It's going to cost you a lot more than you probably expected. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, if you have a savings goal, having an emergency fund is going to really help you out, because again, you can stay intensely focused on that savings goal instead of worrying about what if something happens? What if I lose my job? What if my car breaks down? What if? We already have that money set aside. And now in case something happens, at least you can reach in, take that money, take care of the problem, replenish your emergency fund, and then continue on with your savings goal, instead of having to take all of that savings money that you've been saving, rip it out, and then, ask to borrow money, or put some money on, put some things on credit cards or something else that's going to really, really set you back and make your situation even more challenging to get out of moving forward. You don't have to worry about that. You just have to take the money from the emergency fund, which again, psychologically, it's not the same as your savings account that has money going for your savings goal, right? This is an account that is only for emergencies, and you don't touch it, and it basically does not exist unless an emergency comes up. So psychologically, you'll also feel a little bit better about that as well if your emergency fund takes a hit. So that's also something interesting to think about and to consider as well. Now, I know there's tons of reasons why an emergency fund is so important, and hopefully one of these reasons has actually struck a chord with you, and you say, oh, you know what? I think Lee's right. I probably need to have an emergency fund. So hopefully, this video helped you if you were not really sure what an emergency fund was. And also if you weren't really sure why it's important or why you should really have one, hopefully you know the answer. Now, if you can think of some other reasons why an emergency fund is super duper important, go ahead and leave that in the comments below, and I definitely would love to chat with you about it. And also, it's gonna be great for other people watching this video who are also curious. So go ahead and do that for me. Also, if you haven't hit the subscribe button already, go ahead and do that and hit the notification bell to be alerted every time I make a new video. And I'll see you next time.